From his corner office, 40 floors up, Arthur Vance watched Christmas unfold across the city. It was a blizzard of fractured light, a kaleidoscope of cheer he viewed from a sterile glass box in the sky. Below, tiny figures scurried through streets dusted with the first whispers of snow, their arms laden with bright packages, their heads bowed in shared laughter. The faint, tinny plea of a Salvation Army bell was the only sound that pierced the triple-paned silence of his world. His desk was a vast expanse of polished mahogany, empty except for a single leather-bound ledger. The final numbers for the quarter were in. Profits were up. Acquisitions were successful. The Vance empire was stronger than ever. He had won, again, and he felt nothing. The silence in the office was a heavy blanket, smothering sound and feeling alike. It was the same silence that awaited him in his sprawling penthouse, a museum of wealth where the only resident was the echoing footfall of a lonely man. Christmas Eve. The words tasted like ash. For others, it was a time of connection, family, love. For Arthur, it was merely a forced shutdown of the global markets, a 24-hour pause in the relentless pursuit of more. He saw his reflection in the darkened glass, a man in a perfectly tailored suit, with eyes that held the cold glint of polished steel, a king on a throne of solitude. He couldn't bear the silence tonight. Not tonight. He needed noise, distraction. He grabbed his overcoat, a cascade of black cashmere, and descended to the world he owned but did not inhabit. Walking through the festive crowd, his face was a mask of indifference. The joyful chaos was a language he no longer understood. The smell of roasted chestnuts, the sound of carols spilling from a church, a child's face pressed against the toy store window. It was all an elaborate performance, and he didn't have a script. End of P. He found himself before a small, steamy café called the Daily Grind. It was unremarkable, wedged between two glittering department stores. But through the condensation on the window, he could see it was quiet, a refuge. He pushed the door open, a small bell heralding his arrival. The air was warm, thick with the smell of coffee and cinnamon. He found a small table in the corner, placing his expensive briefcase on the empty chair beside him, a silent declaration that the space was his. He sat staring into a cup of black coffee, when a small voice cut through his thoughts, clear and sharp as a shard of ice. "Excuse me, mister." He didn't look up, assuming it was a waitress. "Just the coffee," he said, his voice clipped and dismissive. The voice persisted, closer now. "I don't want to buy anything. I just wanted to ask you a question." With a sigh of profound irritation, Arthur Vance finally lifted his gaze. Standing before him was a little girl, no older than 7 or 8. Her coat was faded pink with frayed cuffs. Her hair was held back by a simple clip, and her eyes, wide and startlingly clear, were fixed on the chair beside him. There was no timidity in her gaze, only a frank and unnerving curiosity. She pointed a small, gloved finger at the briefcase. "Is this seat only for the rich?" The question hung in the air, absurd and yet deeply profound. Arthur's world of calculated moves and leveraged buyouts ground to a halt. He was a man who could command boardrooms and dismantle corporations with a single phone call, but he had no answer for the little girl in the worn pink coat. He simply stared, the walls of his isolation breached by the innocent, devastating inquiry of a child. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, he was speechless. The question was so direct, so devoid of the deference he was used to, that it felt like a physical blow. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, demanding she realize her impertinence and retreat. But the girl didn't retreat. She stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "My mom and I have been walking for a long time," she explained, her tone simple and matter-of-fact. "Her feet are tired." That's the last empty chair in the whole place. But your briefcase is sitting on it. So I just wondered if it was a special chair, like you have to have a lot of money to sit there. Arthur followed her gaze to his Brioni briefcase, handcrafted from alligator leather, a subtle but unmistakable symbol of his status. To him, an accessory. To this child, a barrier. He then looked past her, towards the door. A woman stood there, leaning against the frame, her face etched with exhaustion. Her coat was too thin for the biting wind, and she was trying to subtly rub one foot against the back of her other leg. She caught his eye and gave a small apologetic shrug, as if to say, "I'm sorry, kids." Annoyance warred with a strange, unfamiliar emotion. His instinct was to shut it down, to end the interaction with a cold stare. But the girl's words echoed in his mind. Is this seat only for the rich? He had spent his life creating spaces that were, in essence, only for the rich, exclusive clubs, private jets, corner offices. He had mistaken insulation for security, exclusivity for success. Now, in this humble café, the very principle by which he lived was being thrown back at him, not as an accusation, but as a genuine question from a child who just wanted a place for her tired mother to sit. Slowly, deliberately, he reached over, grabbed the briefcase, and placed it on the floor. The gesture felt monumental, like lowering a drawbridge that had been raised for decades. "No," he said, the word foreign on his tongue. "It's not only for the rich." He looked at the woman by the door. "Please, sit down." The woman, Sarah, approached cautiously, murmuring her thanks. Her daughter beamed, a smile so bright, it seemed to light up their gloomy corner. She scrambled onto the chair before her mother could, her small legs dangling high above the floor. Sarah sank into the other, letting out a sigh of relief so profound it was almost a prayer. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but strained. "We were just trying to get warm before the last bus." Arthur merely nodded, ready to retreat into his silence. The transaction was complete. But the little girl had other plans. "My name is Lily," she announced, as if they were old friends. "What's yours?" "Arthur," he replied, the name feeling stark and formal. "Arthur," she repeated, tasting the name. "You look sad. Is it because you're all alone on Christmas Eve?" His jaw tightened. "I'm not sad. I'm busy." It was his standard reply, a shield against any personal inquiry. Lily tilted her head. "Busy doing what? Staring at your coffee?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I think you're busy being lonely." The observation was so brutally honest, so piercingly accurate, that Arthur felt a crack appear in the icy facade he'd maintained for years. He'd stared down titans of industry and heads of state without flinching. Yet this small child, with her clear eyes and simple words, had seen straight through the billion-dollar fortune to the hollow man within. He didn't know how to respond. He changed the subject. "What do you and your mother do for Christmas?" Lily's face lit up. "Mom makes her special roasted chicken. It's the best, and we watch It's a Wonderful Life. Mom says it's important to remember that every person's life touches so many other lives. And we drink hot chocolate with extra marshmallows." To Lily, this wasn't a modest holiday. It was a list of priceless treasures. "We just have to catch the number 42 bus to get home to do it," Sarah added, a line of worry creasing her brow as she glanced at the clock. "It's the last one of the night." As if on cue, a news report on a small TV above the counter broke the cafe's gentle hum. The light snow had unexpectedly intensified into a full-blown blizzard. All public transportation was being suspended immediately. Sarah's face fell. The color drained from her cheeks, replaced by the pale mask of quiet panic. Arthur watched as she did the quick, desperate math of the financially precarious. A hotel was out of the question. A taxi in a blizzard, with holiday surge pricing, would be astronomical. Home was 7 miles away, an impossible walk. He saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear he used to see in his own mother's decades ago, when an unexpected bill meant no heat. It was a fear he had dedicated his life to eradicating, burying it under mountains of cash until he could no longer remember how it felt. This was the moment. The old Arthur Vance, the man who had walked into this café 30 minutes ago, would have seen this as someone else's problem. He'd have finished his coffee, picked up his briefcase, and walked out into the snow, insulated from their crisis. He might have left $100 bill on the table, a transaction, not an act of kindness, a way to purchase a clear conscience. But the old Arthur was no longer entirely in control. Lily's questions had been like pebbles thrown onto a frozen lake, and the ice was fracturing. He looked at the little girl, oblivious to her mother's panic, humming a Christmas carol. He looked at Sarah, trying desperately to appear calm, her hands twisting in her lap. He heard his own voice, though it sounded different. "I have a driver. He's waiting. I can give you a ride home." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise and suspicion. She was a woman accustomed to the world taking, not giving. Charity from a man like Arthur likely came with strings attached. "Oh no, we couldn't possibly," she began. "You've already been so kind." "It's no trouble," Arthur insisted, leaving no room for argument. He was on familiar ground now. "Giving orders. It's dangerous outside. You have no other option." The bluntness was not meant to be cruel, but practical and true. Sarah looked at Lily, then at the swirling white vortex outside the window. She had no other option. "Okay," she whispered, the word a mix of gratitude and trepidation. "Thank you." A few minutes after Arthur's brief call, a long black Maybach pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the thick snowfall. The ride was a journey across universes, a capsule of silent, opulent luxury. The raging blizzard was reduced to a distant whisper. Sarah sat stiffly, afraid to touch anything. But Lily was enchanted, running her small hand over the polished wood grain. For the first time ever, the suffocating silence of Arthur's car was filled with a child's happy chatter. "Wow! Is this your car, Arthur?" Lily asked. "It is," he replied. "It's bigger than our whole kitchen," she exclaimed. She told him about her teacher, Mrs. Gable, who gave her a star sticker for her drawing of a rainbow. She told him about the stray cat behind her apartment building that she fed and named Mr. Patches. Then she asked, "What are you getting for Christmas, Arthur?" He stopped, about to give a non-committal answer. What was he getting? Another expensive watch he'd never wear? A case of vintage wine he'd never drink? Tokens of obligation, not affection. "I'm not sure," he said, the admission feeling strangely naked. Lily's brow furrowed. "Nobody told you what they're getting you? Isn't that the fun part, guessing?" She patted his arm reassuringly. "Don't worry. I bet it's something great." Then she leaned in, her voice low and serious. "Do you know what I'm getting my mom? It's a secret, so you can't tell." He found himself leaning in as well. "I won't tell a soul. I made her a picture," she whispered proudly. "It's a picture of us, holding hands. And I used the silver glitter glue." Arthur swallowed against a strange tightness in his throat. He thought of the $500,000 necklace he'd once bought his ex-wife. She had worn it once. He couldn't remember the last time he'd received a gift someone had made. Something that had cost nothing but time and love. "And you know what I asked Santa for?" Lily continued. "New gloves for my mom. Her old ones have a hole in them. And her hands get so cold when she waits for the bus to her second job." He looked at Sarah in the dim light. Her hands were clasped in her lap, and he could just make out the worn fabric of her gloves. Her daughter's only Christmas wish was to soothe one of her mother's small daily discomforts. The car slowed. "We're here, Mr. Vance." They were parked in front of a tired brick apartment building. One window on the third floor glowed with a warm, inviting light, a single star in a dark sky, framed by a string of cheerful, multicolored lights. "This is us," Sarah said softly. She turned to him, her face a mask of gratitude and social awkwardness. I don't know how to thank you. It was nothing," Arthur said automatically. "No," she corrected him gently. "It was everything." As they got out, Sarah fumbled for her keys, her hands shaking from the cold. She felt she owed this strange, sad, kind man something more. Would you like to come in for a cup of tea?" she asked, the offer costing more courage than he could imagine. "It's not much, but it's warm." Here was his escape. He could politely decline, get back into his hermetically sealed car, and return to his hermetically sealed life. The logical choice, the safe choice. But then he looked at Lily. She was staring up at him, her hopeful eyes asking another silent question. "Are you going to be alone again?" The thought of returning to the suffocating silence of his empty mansion was suddenly more terrifying than stepping into their world. "Yes," Arthur heard himself say. "I'd like that very much." The hallway smelled of dust and damp wool. The paint was peeling. It was the kind of place he had clawed his way out of and sworn never to return to. Yet he felt no revulsion, only a strange sense of coming home. Sarah unlocked the door to apartment 3B. "It's not much," she apologized again. She was right. The apartment was a single main room with mismatched furniture. But it was immaculate. And it was filled with a palpable warmth that had nothing to do with the hissing radiator. Handmade paper snowflakes were taped to the walls. A tiny lopsided Christmas tree stood on an end table, adorned with a single string of lights and homemade ornaments. On top sat a crooked cardboard star covered in tin foil. It was the most beautiful Christmas tree Arthur had ever seen. The air smelled of cinnamon and roasted chicken. To Arthur, the meal was less than he'd spend on an appetizer. To them, it was everything. "Make yourself at home," Sarah said, hanging his heavy coat on a hook, where it looked absurdly out of place. Lily grabbed his hand. "Come see my presents," she insisted, pulling him toward the tiny tree. Beneath it sat a library copy of Charlotte's Web and a folded piece of construction paper. With great reverence, Lily unfolded the paper. Two stick figures, one tall and one small, held hands under a smiling sun and a silver glitter rainbow. "For Mom," was written in careful, childish script. "It's beautiful," Arthur said, and the words were not a nicety. They were the absolute truth. The million-dollar paintings on his walls were assets. They had value. This simple drawing had worth. "Would you like to share our dinner?" Sarah asked from the kitchen. "There's plenty." There wasn't, of course. His presence meant smaller portions for them. But he knew refusing would be a greater insult than accepting. "I would be honored," he replied. They sat at a wobbly card table. Sarah placed a plate in front of him. As he took the first bite, he realized it was the most delicious thing he had tasted in 20 years. He wasn't just tasting food. He was tasting pride, effort, and love. They ate, and for the first time in memory, Arthur was part of a we. After dinner, exhaustion finally caught up with Lily. Sarah gently carried her to the small sofa and tucked a faded quilt around her. The apartment grew quiet, but it was a soft, peaceful silence. Sarah sat back down with 2 mugs of tea. "I'm sorry," she said. "She gets so excited." "Don't be," Arthur said. She's remarkable. Sarah spoke, her voice low. It's hard, sometimes, especially this time of year. My husband, Lily's father, he passed away 4 years ago. A construction accident. Since then, it's just been us. I work 2 jobs, waitress during the day, cleaning offices at night, just to keep our heads above water. But I try to make sure she has magic. Every child deserves magic. She spoke without a trace of self-pity. And to his own astonishment, Arthur found himself talking. The words spilled out. A torrent released from a dam he didn't know was there. I grew up like this, he said, gesturing at the small apartment. Poorer, even. I remember the cold, the worry. I spent my whole life running from it. I swore I would build a fortress of wealth so high that nothing could ever touch me again. He paused, staring into his mug. And I did. I built an empire. I acquired a wife who looked good on my arm. We had a son. But I was never there. I was always closing a deal, building the fortress, but I was locking myself inside it. My wife eventually left. My son, he's a stranger. I have everything I ever thought I wanted, and I have nothing. He finally looked at Sarah. Her eyes were filled not with pity, but with deep, compassionate empathy. He glanced at the window and saw his reflection in the dark glass. A hollow man. But superimposed over his face was the reflection of the room behind him. The lopsided tree, the sleeping child, the warmth, the love. Lily's question came back to him, no longer about a chair, but about his very existence. Is this seat only for the rich? Yes, it was. His entire life was a VIP section with a capacity of 1. The cost of his fortune was his soul. In that humble room, surrounded by a love he hadn't earned, Arthur Vance finally understood. The poor girl hadn't just asked him a question. She had shown him the door to his own prison. It was late, the sacred hours of Christmas morning approaching. He knew he had to leave, but he also knew he could not go back. The man who had entered apartment 3B was not the same man who was about to leave. He stood, and Sarah walked him to the door. Thank you, he said. The words inadequate. For everything, he thought. He couldn't just write a check. That was the old Arthur's way. Sarah, he began, his voice hesitant. I would like to help, not as a handout, but as a friend. She searched his eyes and saw only sincerity. She thought of Lily's wish for new gloves, of the constant, grinding worry. She nodded slowly. Okay, Arthur. He didn't go back to his penthouse. He went to his office and made a series of phone calls, orchestrating a quiet miracle. On Christmas morning, a discreet van pulled up to the apartment building. The first box delivered contained food, enough to stock their pantry for months, including a dozen bags of hot chocolate with extra marshmallows. The next held clothes, a warm, durable winter coat for Sarah, new boots and sweaters. Tucked in the coat pocket was a small box. Inside, a pair of beautiful cashmere-lined leather gloves. For Lily, there was a new pink coat, art supplies with every color of glitter glue, and a shelf's worth of books that were hers to keep. At the bottom of one box was a framed certificate, a fully funded college scholarship, established in her name. The most important delivery arrived an hour later. It was Arthur. He wasn't wearing a suit or carrying a briefcase. He knocked on the door himself, holding a bag from a bakery. When Sarah opened it, he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. I was hoping, he said, that I hadn't missed breakfast. That Christmas day was the first truly joyful day of Arthur Vance's adult life. He sat on the floor with Lily, laughing as he struggled to assemble a dollhouse. He listened as Sarah talked about her dream of opening a bakery. He helped peel potatoes. He watched It's a Wonderful Life, and for the first time, he understood its message. He had found his family in apartment 3B. 1 year later. It was Christmas Eve again. Arthur, Sarah, and Lily sat at the same small table in the daily grind, filled with laughter and 3 cups of hot chocolate with extra marshmallows. Lily chattered about her new school. Sarah, looking rested and happy, was now the owner of Sarah's Sweets, a thriving bakery she'd opened with a small business loan she insisted on repaying. Arthur himself was a different man. The cold glint in his eyes had been replaced by a warm light. He had launched the Lily Foundation, a philanthropic arm of his company dedicated to helping single-parent families. He had even begun reconnecting with his son. Lily, finishing her hot chocolate, looked up at him. "Mr. Arthur?" "Just Arthur, Lily," he smiled. "Arthur," she corrected herself. "Do you remember last year, when I asked if this seat was only for the rich?" A warmth spread through his chest. "I remember it like it was yesterday." She beamed, that same brilliant smile that had shattered his world. "I'm glad it's not," she said, patting his hand. "I'm glad it's for friends." Arthur looked from her radiant face to her mother's loving smile. He realized the little girl in the faded pink coat had asked a question that changed his life forever. But the true miracle wasn't the question, it was the answer. He had spent his life believing wealth was the key to an exclusive room, only to discover the door was open to everyone. The price of admission wasn't money, it was kindness, it was love. His greatest acquisition wasn't a company, it was a seat at this table, surrounded by his family.